My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm joined today by another arm of the data-driven strength team, Josh Pelland. Josh, how are you?
I'm doing well, man. There's I guess 4 of us, so it would be a funnier joke if there were 3 arms. But we'll just skip over that right now. But I guess I'm perhaps one of 4 limbs, so it's good to be here, man.
Yeah, another limb of the data-driven strength team. So before we get into the episode, I did want to mention to everyone listening that I do have a Patreon page, which is patreon.com/philosophical weightlifting. You can go there for access to other podcasts and articles and content that I put up more so to fund the podcast and fund myself. So I'd go check that out. That's going to be linked in the description. And then a big project I've kind of been working on with Weightlifting House is coaches only. And one of the really exciting things is Zach Robinson from Data Driven Strength will be giving a talk and kind of leading us off. And he's going to be discussing a lot of the concepts he's studied and really thought a ton about over the last handful of years. Kind of in an academic theory and in a practical setting. So really, really excited for that talk. Those are always very exciting for me to bridge theory and practice, to try to look at the research that's available and say, what can we glean from this and how can we modify or think about practice a little differently. So really excited for that. And Josh, actually, I kind of know you indirectly through Zach. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to get you on the podcast is, one, get you some exposure to the weightlifting world, because I think you guys just kind of as a group do really good work. You put out really great content related to training, kind of from top to bottom. So I'd say, if you're thinking about it more from the kind of like a deep physiology level, which is maybe touched a little bit less in the content, but all the way to like sets and reps that could be applied in practice over time. What does that look like? How did you first get hooked up with Zach and kind of start to create like this mastermind group that's allowed to be developed and kind of grow into what it is?
Yeah, man. So I think Zach just from his time in Columbus, Ohio. And that's also how I got to know Zach. So, I showed up on campus as a biomedical engineer is kind of what I initially declared my major as. And about 4 weeks into the semester, I was like, screw this. The first semester of my college career. And I, lucky enough to have very supportive parents, hopped on a call with them and they were like, yeah, you should change, like do what you want. So I switched over to exercise science, basically right away within kind of my undergrad time at Ohio State. And maybe 1 or 2 semesters later in one of my classes, a professor at Ohio State named Brian Vogt, he came in to give a talk just about his research in general. And at the end, he was like, hey, by the way, I'm looking for some undergrad assistants in my laboratory to carry out some of the research I mentioned here. And at that time, I was starting to get interested in... Actually, I take that back. I was really interested in the science of resistance training. Like I was definitely watching like Jeff Nippert in high school, and freshman year of college was like starting to know who like Eric Helms was, Brad Schoenfeld, etc. And I was like, oh, this is that research thing that they often kind of they kind of mention. So right after that lecture, I was like, hey man, like, can I be there tomorrow? And it wasn't the next day I was in there, but kind of after getting oriented in the lab, the project we were working on at the time was going kind of off campus to work with some clinical patients and help them execute resistance training programs. And I didn't have a car at the time, and the research coordinator was like, hey, I'm going to give you the contact information for this guy that is already kind of like been helping in the lab for a bit. And so I shoot this guy an email, and he's like, yeah, like, how's the Shell gas station right off campus? I'll just go pick you up there. And he picked me up from the Shell gas station, took me out there. This is Zach. And I think I mentioned rating of perceived exertion or reps in reserve or something to him. And he knew what that was. And I was like, let's go. This is awesome. And, from there, we just started kind of training together, and we spoke the same language. So, and then data-driven strength just kind of evolved from there, I guess, in a kind of intentional, kind of unintentional way.
Yeah. So you mentioned going from biomedical engineering to exercise science, but preceding that even decision, were you kind of involved in athletics or involved in some sort of like strength and conditioning or something initially?
Yeah. So I played baseball and basketball growing up, and then I kind of made the decision that I had to focus on one. So basketball was kind of my thing. And, I had some D2, D3 opportunities kind of coming out of high school. But I realized that wasn't going to be a smart call for me, because I remember the last game of every single season, whether that was like the off-season AAU team or the varsity team. Like, I was happy when the season ended, even if that meant like losing in a playoff game, because that meant I had more time to train. And that's really how I got into lifting. Shout out to Deep Impact Performance Training in Mundelein, Illinois. That is where I did some private strength and conditioning and had my first strength and conditioning job when I was kind of home for the summers in college. And I just loved the training side of things, so I cared more about the preparation for athletics. And I knew that was the case. Decided not to take the big time offers I had, and eventually was like, all right, exercise science is the way to go.
Yeah. Do you remember the first time you touched a barbell or entered a weight room and like resistance trained?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't off the top of my head, but I do know that we were lucky enough in high school to have like a strength and conditioning class. And I think it was sophomore year of high school was the first time that most of us took it. And the summer before sophomore year, I was like, I have to be able to squat at least a 25 on each side. So I just remember training my tail off so that I could go in there sophomore year of high school strength conditioning class and be able to squat 95 pounds. So I remember that was like the first real resistance training I had was before sophomore year of high school. That was the goal. Don't embarrass myself in strength conditioning class.
Yeah. And what do you think initially led to pursuing content from Jeff Nipper, Eric Helms, Brad
Mhm.
Schoenfeld? Like what was that drive to make it a more, um, I guess like a more complex approach to something that can be simple, which is like
Yeah.
go and do whatever prescribed and then leave. The mission of Weightlifting House is to bring the sport of weightlifting closer to the coaches, fans, and athletes. They're able to do this by supporting the Philosophical Weightlifting podcast. You can use the code PHILWL, that's PHILWL, at the USA Weightlifting House store. That will save you 10% off all products, including bars, straps, wraps, singlets, and anything else you could imagine. That is PHILWL, PHILWL, to save 10% off everything at the Weightlifting House store. And by supporting the podcast, you support Weightlifting House.
Yeah, that's a good question, and you're making me reflect a lot. My initial thought is that I think, like anyone getting into fitness, there is no shortage of content by any means, and especially for more analytical types, conscientious types, you kind of are able to be like, you're just skeptical, right? You're just kind of skeptical by nature, and you're like trying to create some sort of mental model, and you're like, these mental models don't really like what person A and person B are seeing are totally at odds with each other. Like, I need something to be able to orient towards, if that makes sense. And this is kind of a side point, but sometimes people kind of get into camps, and that the ideology of that camp, I think, can sometimes be a net positive, even if it's not the most accurate thing necessarily, but just because there's something to orient yourself towards. and something to kind of defend, if you will. But I guess just from like a logical or analytical perspective, I was like, I think the best thing to use would be the research. And then I kind of found, like I said, Jeff Nippard, Mass Research Review crew, Eric Helms, etc. As a result of Jeff Nippard. And I was like, oh, this seems like the most reliable source of information with the least red flags possible. We were kind of talking about this off air, but I come from a very analytical family, like a lot of people kind of in the not necessarily medical doctors, but kind of in the healthcare field or engineers. And um, I think just being able to like defend positions is something I've always
Mm.
valued, kind of growing up, and that's kind of what led me down this research path.
Yeah, and then you mentioned your undergraduate studies at the Ohio State University, getting involved with some sort of like clinical oncology resistance training
Mhm.
research. Maybe you can kind of take us through that timeline of kind of meeting the guy who allowed you access to those opportunities and what that looked like to evolve to ultimately what I think we'll discuss mostly, which is kind of what you're looking at for your dissertation.
Yeah, so kind of my time at Ohio State, the specific project we were working on was kind of a lifestyle intervention, which included resistance training in patients with above a certain threshold of BMI and had osteoarthritis in their knees. So that was kind of the specific population. And hey, man, at the end of the day, research does really rely on grad students, especially, and then if you have some good undergrad students, they're super helpful as well. So I was doing basically the main work I was doing was going out to these centers in the community, helping these participants execute the resistance training protocols, teaching them how to use things like RPE. Their part of the intervention was also like these kind of like nutrition counseling aspect, which I didn't lead at that point, but I was able to like assist with that sort of thing. Um, and then also helping with some of the actual testing sessions. So like doing things like timed up and go tests, or like a quarter-mile walk test, or like how long it takes this individual to go up and down the stairs, right? And I just really enjoyed it. Like it wasn't necessarily the background I was from, right? Because I kind of, as I mentioned, got into it from an athletics perspective. What I was most interested in was strength and hypertrophy. But I was like, if I like this, I'll probably like something that's really in my wheelhouse in terms of what I'm thinking about just in my free time, and that's specifically strength and hypertrophy was really what I was interested in. And the professor whose lab I was helping out in at Ohio State, Brian Vogt, he had a connection, or he's just friends with or colleagues with Mike Zordos at Florida Atlantic, and Zach was about 1 year ahead of me or so, and he was able to kind of leverage that connection and some persistence on his end as well to give him some credit, to be able to land a position as a master's student at Florida Atlantic, and then that made it pretty easy for me because Zach was able to make a big impact in the lab down here when he landed. So, his recommendation for me went a long way. And I was able to, you know, start my master's at Florida Atlantic. So I finished my master's. The years kind of jumbled together, man, but I think it was 2022 I finished my master's. Yeah. And then I went through the whole PhD application process, flew around the country a little bit, interviewed at some places. But ultimately decided to stay at Florida Atlantic, same lab, same advisor, Mike Zordos, to pursue my PhD. And I'm still pushing the ball up the hill in terms of my dissertation and just the program in general. But we're making progress for sure.
Yeah. What was the your kind of area of emphasis or area of study for your master's?
Yeah. So at least in our lab, there's kind of two arms to what you're doing from a research perspective. It's what the lab is doing, and also whatever's relevant to like your master's thesis or your PhD dissertation. So during my master's time, my master's thesis specifically was looking at the influence of repetitions per set on the accuracy of rating RPE, or reps in reserve. So specifically in the area of RIR accuracy. We published a paper using a lot of that data. The lead author is another one of our coaches at Data Driven Strength, Jake Remmert. So if anyone's interested, they can check out a paper that was published within the last couple of years from Jake Remmert et al., looking at changes in bench press RP accuracy across a 6-week program. And then also at that time, we were doing a training study looking at different RPEs, which was recently pre-printed. Zach Robinson is the lead author on that one. I was able to be the lead author on a narrative review on kind of current issues in the research in terms of quantifying and reporting proximity to failure. So that's out there as well. So really in this kind of RPE and proximity to failure wheelhouse during my master's. And then some of that has continued on into kind of my time as a PhD student, and now also, starting to ramp up the specific dissertation project as well.
Now, this is a big question, and I'll rely on your expertise as someone who's talked about this extensively to kind of to shape it. How has your thinking changed with regards to RPE and RIR and proximity to failure kind of throughout those years? One, studying it, reading as much of the research as necessary to be able to formulate or create some sort of narrative review. And then to also apply that into practice, which is kind of the three arms, right? Which I see as or three limbs of being important, is being able to kind of read the theoretical stuff, kind of read some more applied research, and then also put it into practice and like see what happens. So how's your thinking changed with regards to what you mentioned, those three papers covering?
Yeah, I'll start with the RPE accuracy side of things because this is maybe just me getting something off my chest. A lot of evidence-based people will kind of allude to how inaccurate people are at reading their RPEs, and we definitely see examples of that in the research. The lead author is escaping my brain right now, but there is a study where they take folks from like the University Rec Center or whatever it was, and we're like, hey, what do you usually use for sets of 10 on the bench press? And they had them use that load and go to failure in a lab setting, and they got like way more than 10 reps. And yeah, there's examples of that. We've observed pretty bad RP accuracy, so we're talking off by like 5 reps on average, even at times in our lab. But a lot of times RP accuracy is very easily fixable with some anchoring and some general knowledge. So like, for example, this data is yet to be analyzed, but I'm aware of like the means and standard deviations here. Like if we take subjects that are pretty well trained and we put them on a new exercise, their RPs are pretty bad, like the first time they do it. But then by the end of a training study, we test their RP accuracy again. It's like right on the money. And if you just look at the research as a whole, it seems that, okay, when you put someone that's untrained onto a new exercise or someone that's trained onto a new exercise, and you have them estimate their RP for like their first working set or their first session or two of that exercise, like, yeah, it's prone to inaccuracy. But if you kind of anchor it for them, people can be really, really accurate. And like the most recent meta-analysis on the topic from Halpern and colleagues showed an average inaccuracy or an average prediction error of just about 1 rep on average, which I think makes RPE extraordinarily useful and like probably like a no-brainer tool for strength and hypertrophy training. I would even say it's at the point where I think some of the limitations of velocity have led to me just almost exclusively using RPE, except for certain scenarios. So that's on the RP accuracy front. And then from a strength and hypertrophy perspective, I would say my mindset has shifted a little bit over time, just seeing like more data, more practical experience as well. But in about 2019 or 2020, Zach and I published a blog on Brian Miner's website. I think it was titled like Rethinking Proximity to Failure for Strength Gains. And basically we made the argument that proximity to failure in isolation does not impact strength gains directly. Now, other things can influence RPE, and then as a result, strength gains can improve, right? So like if you increase load at a given number of reps, yeah, the RPE is going to go up, but it's the load that's driving that effect as opposed to the proximity to failure. So we kind of made that argument, and I think the response was kind of polarizing at the time. And sometimes you get things right and it feels good. Sometimes you get things wrong and it doesn't feel good. I think we were right there, based on some more recent analyses. So on the strength side, I think kind of our work in our lab from an experimental perspective, and then from like a meta analytic perspective, that kind of opinion has been reaffirmed. And then from the hypertrophy side, I would say I've shifted more towards proximity to failure mattering. I was pretty far on the side of like I just don't think it matters as long as it's reasonable. But I think that's kind of shifted from a hypertrophy perspective. But that also kind of coincides with a change in perspective regarding fatigue, specifically for hypertrophy. I think humans are pretty damn good at adapting to things, and if you train to failure a lot, or train really close to failure, you can get used to it. And the cost benefit analysis can often lean in favor of those closer proximities to failure for hypertrophy.
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
Yeah, and I know, anecdote can only take you so far, but I was actually with Max Ada over the weekend, and he told us this anecdote of when he was attempting a 160 kilo clean and jerk, and the coach he trained under, his name's Steve Goff. He trained like a typical, quote unquote typical like Bulgarian style, which was heavy singles, in the squat, heavy single in the snatch, heavy single in the clean and jerk, heavy single in the squat. They would do that like multiple times a day. And he said he took a max clean and jerk, I think in one day over a couple of sessions, like 30 times. And every time he talks about his training, which was, I think for 8 to 10 years, he maxed out his front squat like 3 times a day, maybe more. It's like he kind of just lived at the gym. And I always think, like, how in the world could you do that? Like, how could you tolerate that training? And I think it's that also that idea of like, I think people are very adaptable, and it's more so like the grading of that training, or the grading of that exposure to the training versus like the training itself. Of course, if you get like dumped into something well beyond what you're capable of doing or have ever done, it's probably going to be an adverse experience. But if you just like ramp up like quote unquote intelligently, you could probably tolerate a lot more. And I think there's a point made by Eric Helms, I think, when he talks about RPE stops, so trying to have volume dictated by some like RPE endpoint. I'm sure that's been explained way better in a bunch of different places, but for the purpose of this conversation, he kind of made the comment of, well, you just kind of develop work capacity for the sake of work capacity. And it's like having this this like ability to flexibly do a certain amount of work, and that can change without much of a beneficial effect with respect to hypertrophy or strength. But it's something separate that you can also improve on. So when you talk about, like that idea of, maybe training to failure or closer to failure, and people thinking like, oh, well, you're just going to like, quote unquote, blow something out. You can actually adapt to it and do it, and maybe do it well. How has that changed your prescriptive practice when you kind of think about those adjustments to RPE and proximity to failure for strength and hypertrophy?
Yeah. So I honestly get a little bit of cognitive dissonance here, especially on the strength side, because you mentioned like daily max outs and weightlifting. My advisor, he often likes to brag about not only daily squat 1RMs, but at times twice daily squat 1RMs. And that's something he's done in the past. And before I was part of the lab here at FAU, they published like a case series I think it's 30 straight days of squat, of maxing out on the back squat, which, man, I just, like, on one hand, like I can acknowledge that, but on the other hand, from a practical perspective, a lot of people that would not be called for, that would not be advised. And, like you kind of think of these hypothetical, like scenarios of people not being able to just focus solely on training and just having these other life stressors. And I think when you kind of hear that before you start coaching, you're like, oh, that sounds cool in concept, but like, what's optimal, right? But then you actually get into it and you're like, I guess from like a researcher perspective, I was like, oh yeah, I understand how individuals are different, and people can break up with their girlfriends or their boyfriends or whatever during a training study, but like, I'm sure that rarely happens. And then now at this point, having done a few training studies, it's like, yeah, we had a semester where, of like the 10 participants we had going at that time, like 3 of them had a breakup and some of
Wow.
them had multiple breakups, right? Or like people's dogs dying. Like, these things happen. Or like, I think of, we're recording this in January of 2024, and a lot of the US had like a cold front, right? Especially like Texas probably had it the worst, partly because they're not as prepared. And like, having things flare up as a result of changes in weather, that's something I kind of had to deal with recently. Or autoimmune diseases that people have, right? Like,
Right.
these things, when like, these things matter in practice, and it's helpful to know what drives the response so you can prioritize that when something's got to give, because something often has to give in practice. So from a prescriptive perspective, I know this is a bit of a cop out, but I just think there's such a wide range of things that can work for strength,
Mm.
and knowing what's probably going to drive the response is vital, because if I didn't have some of these tools, I couldn't have these approaches that I have with some of my stronger guys, for example, right? Like, yeah, like, this guy can squat 700 pounds, but like, if he squats 700 pounds, he's not going to do that again for another month.
Right.
It's hard to build back up to that. So like, some guys like that, we might not touch above 600 within like 5 or 6 weeks of stepping on the platform, and like, their heaviest single of prep is like 6 or 8 weeks out.
Wow.
So I know that's doesn't directly answer your question, but I think knowing what drives it, the response, is important to kind of allow things to fit around it. So like, proximity to failure, I think that's very important from a hypertrophy perspective. So if the goal is hypertrophy, as opposed to saying, hey, this is the exercise we're going to do, and we have to train close to failure, I'm going to say, okay, what probably matters is the proximity to failure as opposed to the specific exercise. Let's kind of work around that proximity to failure piece. So, okay, the doing more work on the bench press pisses off your shoulders. Let's move to a more tolerable exercise. So kind of working backwards from what seems to drive the response, I think is vital in practice.
Yeah, I think you made a lot of good points. One too, that kind of circles that idea of daily maxing, or like daily maxing multiple times within a day, and then kind of the point you ultimately got to, which is, I think when you think about daily maxing, you're thinking about optimizing your performance within a shorter or more narrow time span. Whereas when you think about training over this like long term or long amount of time, that's like 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. I mean, I work with someone who she's actually my first like powerlifting athlete, powerlifting client. And I think it's like 8 years later. And if I would have said like at any point, well, let's do daily maxing because that's going to get you the biggest squat, it just kind of constrains the system, like, and constrains like the process of development. And I think what you got to is, okay, we have people who, have, so many, like an uncountable number of differences. And those differences are internal and external, right? They're physiological differences and then also environmental differences. And those interact, but it's uncountable and unpredictable in the way they're going to interact, because it's kind of like the definition of a complex system. So let's organize training in a way to accommodate that and like do the best we can to if I use the word optimize, it's optimized for their individual differences or the variability based on individual response to training. And I think I kind of get to that same point of I'll think about training in a lot of different ways based on what I know or what I think or like what I hear. And it's like, what I do in practice is slightly different. And you're like, oh, it's kind of constrained by the situation. Um, is that something you've kind of like wrestled with, of like a lot of research is founded on a lot of constrained information, or information that like your ability to apply is it's constrained inherently.
Yeah.
How have you kind of come to this point of developing a system that does iterate over time and
Yeah.
optimize for the person?
Oh man, that's a layup question, Josh. You're just you're no, that's a big question, and honestly, something I've changed my mind on since I got involved in research. That's like the most relevant it can be towards practice,
Hmm.
and I think this gets to the difference between internal validity and ecological validity in terms of study designs. Um, so, like the first training study I was a part of, and I mentioned this was recently pre-printed, was a 3 time per week. It was subjects came in 3 times per week, and every single time they came in, they trained the squat and the bench press. And for a powerlifter, that's really ecologically valid.
Hmm.
Um, but then you realize that, like, some people eat that type of program up, and they can dominate it, no problem at all. Some people's knees are always kind of like borderline manageable. Some people just have no shot of getting through the program.
Hmm.
And then you start thinking about, like, man, okay, we're measuring quad muscle thickness, and like the way that participant A is squatting is like, man, that's going to blow his quads up. And then participant B comes over and has the stripper squat action, and it's like, yeah, that's really good technique for you, but your quads aren't going to grow from that,
Right.
or if you're decently trained. So again, that's ecologically valid and definitely helpful. But where the studies we're currently working on typically fall is, I'd say, a little bit more on the internally valid side of things. Now, it's still applied research. We're still measuring the outcome of interest. It's still human beings. Um, and it's still training that generally resembles the type of dosages we would use in practice. But instead, it's like, man, I would rather do a single leg press within subject's design,
Hmm.
and let's take 30 minutes if we have to at your first visit, setting this leg press up to be the best possible quad builder for you, so
Right.
that we can kind of try to compare apples to apples across the participants. Or like, man, I just want to study the biceps or the calves or something that's relatively simple to train, because we're going to have a more kind of internally valid type of response to that. So we can look at the physiological concept. So ultimately, all that's to say is, like, where my head has gone over time as a researcher is, um, our role in the scientific field is to develop these concepts and try to identify um, how humans on average physiologically respond to different stressors. And that's a lot different than saying, like, what's the best RPE to train at
Hmm.
for your 3 time per week squat training program. I don't think that's I think that's useful data to have, but I don't think that's the role of research necessarily. So, like, I think of that squat and bench press study I mentioned, and even some studies that will kind of be out relatively soon that we designed 2 years ago. It's like, I would definitely design that differently now. So anyway, all that's to say is, like, I've changed my view as a researcher and then also a coach in terms of applying that research. Is that you're looking for physiological concepts to understand the directionality and the degree of a relationship, and to some degree the nature of that relationship. Is it a infinite dose response that's linear, or is it kind of diminishing returns? Is there actually this inverted U concept we see with training volume in practice? That's something we'll have insight in relatively soon. And then that is just extraordinarily helpful for a coach, because the coach is going to be able to integrate all the other factors together and come up with a good starting point. And then they can draw on the research as well to say, okay, what conceptually, which direction do I go with different training variables or different programming approaches in the face of a plateau? So I hope that answers your question, but honestly, moving more towards just, again, trying to find the directionality of these physiological phenomenon.
No, I think that was a great answer, and I think it was very comprehensive. And I think the one thing this podcast does well, and what the listeners appreciate, is we bridge that kind of like, I don't want to say I use theory loosely as a word, but like we use that theory, we use that theory, and then we apply it to practice well in the information we get. As far as how your programming has played out, what are you currently thinking about, or like, what have you started to change or manipulated over the last few weeks, months, that reflects this difference in thinking that's happened across time? Has that like panned out in anything different in practice, or is it just kind of a refinement of what has existed?
I'd say the way I program now, I wouldn't say it's night and day different from like, getting into research. But there are definitely things that I've refined and changed my approach as a result, right? The starting points might not be totally different on average. But again, I think the troubleshooting process has changed in the sense that, shout out to Mike Teixeira, right? Like one of the most brilliant minds in the industry, and someone I've looked up to for a while and continue to. And the reason I bring him up is he has this kind of like emerging strategies approach, in the sense that the goal is to find, and I don't mistake this for me putting words in his mouth or trying to perfectly characterize their approach, but the goal is kind of to find these training approaches that work best for the individual. And I don't even know if Mike would say this, but the way that I kind of applied a lot of these concepts was like, you often can't predict those, and they can be really, really weird. And people's physiology is fundamentally different. That's the perspective I used to take, is that like, yeah, maybe accommodating resistance just seems to work well for them because there's some unexplainable physiological thing going on with this individual. Whereas now I'd say, okay, we could still land at accommodating resistance. Like I mentioned, one of my clients that squats 700 pounds. It's like, we use accommodating resistance for his secondary deadlift and his secondary bench press day. Not because I think that there's anything like inherent to his physiology that leads to him responding especially well to that sort of approach, but instead working backwards from what is quote unquote ideal and saying, okay, what's going to drive the response here? Okay, we need a sufficient workload here. We need sufficient practice. We need sufficient loading as well to make that practice relatively specific. But like give someone that strong 2 hard deadlift days a week and good luck, right? You're gonna run into walls in terms of fatigue. But what if we put on, for a 750 pound deadlifter, what if we put 405 on the bar with like some chains that are like 120 pounds at the top? Okay, we know that bottom position is probably going to be a little bit more damaging in terms of the mechanical stress there on the muscles. But we also know those chains at the top are going to be a little bit heavier. It's going to kind of give him that psychological feel like he's lifting heavy weights. It's going to give him some practice with being explosive, kind of off the bottom, which we know is obviously vital to move a 1RM. You're going to need maximal intent. And yeah, it might not be optimal from a hypertrophy perspective, but we're going to get a decent workload there and something that's going to chip into the hypertrophy piggy bank, if you will. So I use that example to say, like, I've changed my thinking about how we get to these creative solutions, not necessarily that creative solutions are necessary. And I think that allows me to get to creative solutions more efficiently, or at least I would like to think so, right? And also probably improve the starting points based on, okay, onboarding a new client. All right, if you're seeking out online coaching, you're probably struggling with something. Like, what's the issue here? And again, it's not that this individual's physiology is different, but instead kind of working backwards from that physiology to say that, okay, yeah, I think like the Brett Gibbs example is one that is often used for like emerging strategies. Like doing 8s going into the most important meet of the year might just be more of a fatigue management thing as opposed to a specific response to 8s for that individual.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I was listening intently, and saying that comes to mind. This is from John Marcus. He's a co-host on the On Coaching podcast, and he works with Steve Magnus. But he said good coaching is thinking in patterns and not pieces. And I think ultimately what we're getting at is like we're trying to identify patterns over a certain period of time, and then use that to then individualized training further, right? It's like, okay, here's this response to, like you said, the starting point can be relatively, it doesn't have to be perfect, because it's not
Mm-hmm.
about the starting point. It's about like, okay, how do you iterate off of that initial condition or initial point? And then seeing how that plays out and saying, okay, there was a positive change, a negative change, or no change. There were, more complaints of X, Y, and Z, and you kind of run through that Rolodex of like what matters, and then how do we change that to make it closer to what we think is best. And that's kind of what I hear with that example of using chains with secondary deadlift and secondary or accommodating resistance with both movements, is maybe that you first experience that with the person just feeling really fatigued and beat up, and they're like, wow, I feel like really shitty, or you miss time a peak, or you do something, and it's like, okay, how can we accommodate that experience or that result? And then you kind of, I think having like a broad coaching skill set, like a broad but refined coaching skill set, allows you to do that ultimately. So I think that's great. I think people are probably going to re-listen to it to try and think about like, okay, how can I, another quote, and I think this is actually from Mike, but coaching being creative problem solving. It's like, how can I become more creative at solving these problems, which ultimately are performance and, all the complexities that go into that. Pivoting the ship slightly, we spoke right before you kind of started recording about your dissertation, and I think that's really interesting. So I'd love to dig into it, kind of what your plans are, what that looks like, and how you think that will ultimately impact practice.
Yeah, I think this is the perfect next thing to talk about, because your question before was like, hey, how is this kind of manifested into actual programming changes, or what are some things going on in your mind in the last few months from a programming perspective? And I determined that I had rambled too much there in my previous answer, but kind of my second point would have been this concept of which will be the focus of my dissertation, and the muscle physiology term, which may not mean a lot to the listener right off the bat, is skeletal muscle resensitization. But I think we can think of this maybe from a more practical perspective as just novelty. And this kind of gets back into what I mentioned before, in that like maybe in the past I would think, hey, this is like the unique recipe that works the best for this individual. But unfortunately, I think that does change quite dramatically over time. And I think part of the reason here is the potential for resensitization or novelty to have a meaningful effect on someone's training. And the way I like to conceptualize this is, if it can be helpful to think of like an untrained individual. So if you have an untrained individual, they're kind of like background status of what they're adapted to in terms of training workload is nothing, right? So if you apply any training stimulus, they're going to see a very positive response. I think that same concept can apply to some degree with different training strategies or changes in certain variables. So, for example, if you have an individual that's been really pushing the workload for their squat, but as a result, their bench and their deadlift workload has been a little bit lower for the last few months. Okay, now kind of this background status of what they're adapted to for bench and deadlift is a little bit lower. So if you increase that workload, it's almost like a micro effect of what you see for an untrained individual, but specific to what they haven't necessarily been prioritizing recently. So what we've seen in the research is that, there's a classic study from Ogasawara where they were untrained, but it was a long enough study that I think like by the end of the study, they were decently trained. So one group trained continuously. I think it was just like 3 sets of bench 2 or 3 times a week. They trained continuously for like 6 months. And then the other group did the same exact protocol when they were training, but they had 2 breaks throughout those 6 weeks where they did no training for 3 weeks. And during those 3-week breaks, muscle size and strength did decrease. However, upon returning, they see this accelerated response. And ultimately, after 6 months, both groups are at a similar spot in terms of muscle strength and in terms of muscle size, despite that group that took the breaks doing about 75% of the total work that the continuous group did. And we see other examples of this as well in the research, including in some rodent data as well. And the question that I'm specifically interested in is like, okay, we see this accelerated response after detraining. And almost always in the research, that comes with a decrease in performance and or a decrease in muscle size as a result of that detraining. So that accelerated response is evidence to me that resensitization, or the ability for the muscle to have an enhanced response after a period of detraining, is 1000% like confirmed in the research. But instead, the question is, can this resensitization or this novelty concept be leveraged to lead to net greater effects in the long term?
Right.
And probably our best bet of doing that is to replace those detraining periods with periods of maintenance. And that's kind of the fundamental physiological concept that we just don't know from the research is, hey, when a muscle is resensitized, or when a motor pattern is resensitized, or whatever, attribute that you're training is desensitized, does that have to come with a decrease in performance or a decrease in muscle size as well? Or can we maintain those attributes and still leverage resensitization? Because if that's the case, then I think you have not only exciting possibilities from a programming perspective, but also a lot of fun training, because you can kind of shift the priority around. And that's something that I have been doing probably for the last year. And, it's really hard to draw causality in terms of like what is leading to a given response for any individual. But what I can say is, even if it's a neutral effect of kind of shifting these priorities around and putting some things on maintenance or at least on a lower dose, it's like a lot of people just really enjoy it. Of like, yeah, this is the squat block, like squat whenever we're doing it. It's first in the session. We're pushing the loads a little bit more. Yeah, deadlifts on maintenance. But like, this is the squat block, and okay, after the squat block or 2 or 3 squat blocks or whatever, it's like, okay, yeah, squat block's not as exciting anymore, but now it's the deadlift block, it's the deadlift block and we're going to have fun. Same idea with hypertrophy, right? You can kind of cycle through your priorities. So, I have been implementing that for a while. It's a ton of fun. Anecdotally, I think there's something there, like even from just like a 1 week deload, that's pretty dramatic. And then I've, kind of started to sympathize with like the Renaissance periodization approach of slowly adding sets for whatever the kind of priority is. And, there's a lot of other confounding factors here. Most of my training recently has been on the hypertrophy side of things, but, I've been doing it with my arm training for the last few months, and, arms have kind of consistently been above 17 inches for the first time in my life. So that's all the evidence you need, right? Is my N of 1 arm circumferences that are probably biased anyway.
Yeah. And the next thing you're going to do is mention the ebook on arm training they're going to release, right?
Yes, exactly. And then 2 years from now, I'm going to say I broke 18 inches and version 2 will be out.
That's great. That's really interesting. So what got you down that rabbit hole initially to say like, okay, this is something I'm going to invest a lot of time in, a lot of resources in? Was it just like playing around with this concept of, or, like, how do we construct deloads?
Yeah.
How do we play around with volumes and intensities? How do we play around with like blocks that are emphasizing certain qualities or certain movements? Like, what led you to the point of thinking that this is a big enough deal that it should um, have its own dissertation dedicated to it?
Yeah. Yeah. So the honest answer is that I think it's going to be very fruitful from a personal perspective, just from like in terms of like the intellectual process of a
Mhm.
dissertation, because this concept of resensitization kind of encompasses everything related to how muscle adapts and what contributes to performance. So like right now, as I work on the initial chapters of my dissertation, like I've spent the last few weeks trying to better understand the exact mechanisms of skeletal muscle memory, which you're diving into rodent studies and looking at oh, this myonuclear domain theory, which I'm sure at least some listeners have heard of, is like this probably contributes, but it actually doesn't seem to be the main factor
Hmm.
contributing to this amplified response after detraining. And I'm trying to go back to my undergraduate and master's program biology courses and try to understand these epigenetic changes that occur within the myonuclei. And then you start thinking about, oh, the epigenetic changes in the myonuclei are different than what's going on in the satellite cell. And you're like, oh, the satellite cell contributes to hypertrophy, but it's not even in the muscle yet. So it's just been like a very honestly fun intellectual process up to this point. And the next part of that starts to get more practical, in that this concept, I think, is very, very high leverage from a practical perspective, because it kind of intersects with periodization as well. It intersects for both high level athletics, because if this can lead to a better net result, then obviously that's of interest, but also for more general population type of folks, right? If the difference between training 2 and 4 times a week is a big difference for the average person, and if you can cycle between an upper body focused program with just a little bit of lower body in there to maintain size, and then flip flop that every 4 to 8 weeks, you just save someone a lot of time and potentially lead them to a very similar spot in the end. So it's kind of this combination of, I just think it's interesting from a physiological perspective. It's something I've noticed personally that, like, man, I think progress goes in spurts. We've mentioned Zach a few times on here. He kind of disagrees with me on that, and I'm sure I'll change my mind on that as we go, at least in one direction or another. Just noticing in clients the effect of something just new in and of itself. Just has all this concept has always just been like, man, I wish we had more research on it. I wish I understood it better. And I was like, man, I think I'm going to learn a lot, and I think the practical utility here is really high.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm sure people, after listening to this podcast, want to know a lot more about data-driven strength, which I would push them to the Coaches Only with Zach Robinson. So when all that's released, I'll kind of spread the information. But as far as your work with DDS, but also just broadly, where can people go to listen in, read it, or learn more about what you do, how you do it, and maybe if they're interested in getting some coaching, where they can find that?
Yeah, if you're interested in the more formal academic stuff, just Google my name, Josh Pelland, followed by the term ResearchGate, and past research that's already been out there. You can find it there, and then if you keep an eye on that, it'll be updated as new stuff from our lab comes out. And then from the coaching side, free content side of things, if you just go to my Instagram, josh.datadrivenstrength, you can sign up to our newsletter there. That's probably the best way to kind of keep in touch with us. And also check out our other coaches, Zach, which is zach.datadrivenstrength, jake.datadrivenstrength, and our the good guy, Drake Easterhot, drake.datadrivenstrength. Give everyone a follow, and it's probably the best way to keep up with us.
Yeah, and to foreshadow the next episode, um, I'm actually going to have Jake on.
Awesome.
So yeah, I thought it'd be cool to just talk to you guys individually, because I've been consuming the
Yeah.
content like a ravenous, training, desperate person. And it's been so much fun, and it's so insightful and such a good blend of theory and practice. So I would really push
Thanks,
people
man.
to all the content you guys have put out. Support you
Jake's will
guys.
be good. Jake's
Yeah.
will be good. He's at least as of recording this, this is the pre-testing week for his dissertation research.
Yeah.
And he just proposed his dissertation, so he's now in
Awesome.
the candidacy phase of his PhD, and his project is really cool, and I'm excited for it. So I'm sure that'll be a good episode as well.
Yeah, I think so as well. For everybody listening who's interested in keeping up with me, you can follow me on Instagram at Josh_Phil WL. That's PHILWL. You can go to teamada.com if you're interested in coaching from myself, Max Ada, or Joanne Ada. As far as content goes, we're still working on websites and getting everything released, but that'll be available in the future. And until next time, we'll catch you all on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.